please feel free to just interrupt me as we go through, and then we can deal with anything as it comes along. It's not particularly formal, so feel free to ask away with anything. So just before we get started, I think we've got a couple of new people. So I'm Martin. I work at a secondary and sixth form school in Suffolk. I've done work for OCR marking papers, which is kind of why I feel half qualified to be able to do this sort of meeting, and hopefully it helps out with some other people in terms of kind of what kinds of things you can do to help the kids, and hopefully get them better exam results when they do start doing their exams again. So the idea of the current sessions moved on to starting to do some work on programming techniques and just showing ways that I teach it. And with in the previous meetings, which you can find on YouTube, I don't know if you've seen the link for them at all. We've covered things like just beginning out with some sequences, and looking at selection, which we're going to just carry on with in today's one. When it comes to writing algorithms, one of the kind of the key bits that I try and impress upon the students that I teach is trying to get a structure that is easy to follow for the examiners. The examiners will always accept kind of writing in a chosen language, and I think especially now going into the new specification, that's going to be very similar, and I can't see it being particularly strict in terms of syntax and that sort of thing as they're going forward, even though they're saying about writing in particular languages for each section of the new specification. I think when you haven't got a computer, they're going to have to be fairly relaxed about the type of syntax and what kinds of things that they're going to accept. But we teach in Python, so for the first year, because we do a 3-year GCSE at the moment, the first year we only do really coding in Python. We don't talk about kind of exam algorithms at all, just spend some time doing some programming with them, and then kind of later on we can then adapt that into exam techniques and what they should do. And so once they start to make that transition, one of the first bits I do is just carry on writing in kind of a Python style, but where you've got your keywords like print and input and so on, just put those in capitals so they stand out. And that just helps to kind of highlight the logic of the program, which then makes it a little bit easier for the examiners to follow, and kind of meets all the criteria that OCR will generally be looking for with their kind of marking of the exams as it comes through. So listed on the screen, hopefully you can see, that is the kind of the main functions that they'll tend to be using, but then there might be something else that they need to do. So they're not necessarily expected to know specifically and remember all kind of functions of a program or a programming language kind of by heart, but what they can do is start to think logically, and if they kind of make up their own function name for something, so they want to use a maximum function, for example, to find the highest number, if they just write max or maximum and create a function, as long as it's descriptive, then the examiner will know what they're trying to do, and see in most cases they should get the marks for that. So it's just about making sure that it's clear what they're trying to do and that there's some structured logic behind it. So what we do is use something called Prim. So Prim is just a structured programming kind of teaching, if you like, looking at trying to get them to understand the code before. I have gone through this quite a lot, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but what we will do is have a look at how it works in progress as we look through some of the techniques. So this is kind of roughly how I split it up. I'll have about 3 or 4 of these for a lesson and when we're dealing with a technique. And obviously, as you can see, they start with a space where they can write down what they think might happen. They're then encouraged to copy the code and run it. Some methods will get them to just run a program file that's already been made for them. I tend to get them to type it out because I think that just helps them to carry on learning how to write the code and making sure they can get the syntax right and get used to writing it as we go through. And there should then be some questions just to help them with what the code is supposed to be doing, understanding how it works. And so this is one of the first lessons. So I've also included things about trying to highlight how Python can be color coded to make it a little bit easier to understand and find errors in there as well. And I put some little bits in there just to get them to change some bits of code as well. So a little bit of kind of modifying inside there as well, just so they can start to play around with it a little bit and not be afraid to make it break, if you like. The modify side of things is where they will then look at having a change of code. So change it to do something slightly different. It could be that you change it to fix an error that you've put in the code. So maybe the original program had an error that you put in there deliberately, and then you just want them to fix it, or you want to just change the purpose and things like that. And then the new side of things, just getting them to create a new file that is using the same techniques. And obviously for this one, it was quite simple, and it was very similar to the initial task as well. So this is kind of roughly how I'd work it. I wouldn't necessarily go step by step and guide them all through unless it's a low ability class or it's one of the first lessons. Once they start to get into the habit of it, they tend to just work through all 5 steps as they go through. So this is a little bit of a program just to have a look at what selection might look like. So I'd give them this code and I'd get them to think about what the code might then do. And it's just about getting them to think about whether they understand and they can trace it line by line. So think about explaining what they think line 1 does, what they think line 3 does, what they think line 4 does, and so on. And then they can kind of group all of that together to see if they can work out what the overall purpose of the program is as well. Then it's a chance to run it, and feel free, if you've got Python open, to have a go at running the code and see whether what you thought initially was correct. I'll just give you a minute or so if you'd like to have a go at trying to do that. So hopefully you've had a go at doing that and been able to work out whether you were right or not. So just going to go through. So then the next stage would then get them to start to think about what the particular parts of the code are doing. So thinking about explaining, in this case, what line 6 is going to do. So what I'm looking for is them identifying the elif and what that might mean, and also the comparison operator in there. And what I can then do is to talk about the logical errors in there, and so I've introduced that one in there. So thinking about the problem that this one doesn't then say anything if the number is less than 6. So there's no no method for catching the other inputs, and so it only works if the number is 6 and if the number is greater than 6. This is similar to a program that I did last week's session where we didn't have the int function, and so this one would be directly after that, so that the students can then see that if they're dealing with the number 6, that's different than the string 6. And obviously they can then see the importance of the data types in there as they go through. And then you can give them a chance to have a go at modifying and making some new code. So again, feel free to have a go through doing that. If you've got any questions about how that might work, then please just let me know. Okay. So then kind of once we've done with selection, I'd then move on to work on looking at some loops. So I'd give them something along these lines. So introducing a for loop to begin with. So introducing them to the terms count controlled loop at this point, so they understand that it's a loop that's based on a counter. Most examples on the internet would use the variable I in here. I tend to change that, at least in the beginning anyway, just to call it a counter, just so that the students get used to it. And they can then look at the range and how that works, and they might not necessarily get this part first time around if they haven't seen the loop before, especially how the range function works. But hopefully once they've had a go at running the code, they'll then see that it counts from 0 up to 9 and that 10 isn't included. So with the range function, it stops kind of one before the final number. And all this is doing is just printing the counter variable. So as it goes through, the first time counter is equal to 0, so it prints 0. Then the second time it's 1, so it prints 1, and so on all the way up to 9. And so 9 is the last one that would then be displayed. And so I'd have some questions based around that. So looking at when it stops, looking at what the purpose of that counter is, and working out how many times it needs to go through. Then I also look at introducing the range function and how it can have an increment value as well. So I've got a little bit of a change that they can make and see how it works. So they've got the 0 and the 10 still, but then get it to increment by 2 each time. So what will happen now is that it starts at 0. So 0 will be printed. It wouldn't do anything with 1. It would change to 2. So the second time through the loop, the counter would be 2 rather than 1. Then the third time it would be 4. And then the fourth time it would be 6, and so on. And then it would stop at 8 because it wouldn't go up to 10. And so they can then see how that works. And then introduce the fact that you can go backwards through the loop as well. So you can go from highest number to lowest number. So you can change the starting, so it'd be 10, 0, and then -1. We'll take 1 off each time. So we'd start with the loop, the counter would be 10, then it would be 9, then it would be 8, and so on. And so we'd be counting from 10 downwards. And so there's just certain things that we can look at introducing to show the students how the for loop works. And I'd normally do 2 or 3 kind of prim tasks based around the for loop so they can start to get to the hang of it. Obviously with that they'd have some modify and some make tasks, so I can look at getting them to understand that incrementer, so introducing the going up by 5 each time, see if they can work that one out. And then looking at changing it slightly, so rather than just displaying the counter, can we display something else? Because in most situations the loop doesn't necessarily display the counter, it's normally just working out how many times it needs to go through and do something. So in this case I just get them to make it so that it displays their name 5 times. And if I just go back to the example, the print side of things wouldn't print the counter variable, we'd change that part to create a string, so we might have this name in a string. They might have put their name in a variable beforehand and then use that variable in print instead, which would be a perfectly valid way of doing it as well. And obviously the range in this case would be 0 to 5, or anything where there's a difference of 5. It doesn't have to start at 0, we can choose whichever numbers we want, as long as we get the desired outcome in terms of the number of iterations of the loop. Then I look at introducing a while loop. So this is one of the later while loops, but the first while loops I tend to do and make them very similar to the for loop, so they can see that you can use a while and a for loop fairly similarly. Obviously there are certain things you can't do with a for loop, but I think it's good for students to guess different ways of doing counters, because the example does tend to test both ways. But we can then start to introduce the fact that these are condition controlled iteration, so the loop will continue until the comparison is no longer true. So in this case we're saying while the password guess is not equal to the correct guess, correct password I should say, we're going to keep asking them to try in their new password. And so as long as this is true, the loop is going to continue, so 5 will keep being repeated as we go through. Once they get it right, I've just got a bit of code next afterwards that says that they've got access granted, so if the loop has stopped, they've clearly managed to get access to the system, which is obviously a very simple password matching login system. And obviously this is something that later on down the line we then look to build on, and we can then start to talk about the defensive design later on, but I don't tend to kind of introduce that until kind of much later on. And obviously they can then see how this works, and obviously see that when they don't type in the correct password, they then have to type it in again until they do get it right. And again, we can then start to think about asking them questions around it. So looking at how many times the program runs. So obviously the previous one, it would have a set number of times, whereas the while loop, it could be once, it could be 10 times, it could be 100 times. So it just depends on how many times the user gets the password wrong. We've then got the computational constructs that we can then link back to it, so get them to think about the different constructs that have been used in here. So you've got the fact that you've got sequences in there, obviously you've got iteration, but you can also talk about the fact that there is actually selection taking place as well, because the condition controlled loop is basically a form of selection. It's just repeating the code if the condition is true, which is obviously very similar to how an if statement works. So they can start to see how the while loop is similar to an if statement, and obviously they can make that link and start to get the ideas all linked together. And what I also like to get them to think about is the data types as well. So see, the fact that the input is a string is one of the things that I keep coming back to with the students, because I think they need to make sure that they make that link that if they're not comparing the right data types, then they're going to have those logic errors that won't work. And obviously we can then talk about those logic errors if I put those in there deliberately or they then accidentally do it. I get them to think about those errors as they go through. And then obviously there's a modify make task to go through with that. So the modify, I'm just getting them to do another version of the same code beforehand, that they have to type in the username correctly. So just as two sections, not as a type in the username, then the password, and then check them both. Just get them to type in the username correctly first and keep repeating until the username is finished and matches. And then once that's working, it can then run through the password section and then go through and do the password section and obviously check whether that's correct or not. And then can look at how we can build upon that as well. So looking at how many numbers the user wants to find an average on, and then get them to keep typing those in. So this a little bit like the counter side of things, and obviously this is when you can start to make those links again with the for loop. And even though we're using the while loop, some students may decide to do it as a for loop instead, not necessarily an incorrect solution. But I'd be trying to encourage them to use while loops within this lesson, because I'd have one lesson based around the for loop and one lesson based around the while loop. And obviously the idea is that they start to get to grips with both of those different techniques as they go through. I don't know if there's any questions or anything at that point, if anyone wants me to go over. Hi Kirsty, can you hear me? So yeah, so that's kind of the end. I don't know if anyone wants me to go over anything at all. I see that it has been recorded, so I'll be putting this onto YouTube fairly shortly as soon as it's saved itself. But I'm more than happy to go through and talk about anything anyone might have missed or wants to just talk about. Okay, well, hopefully you found that useful then. I will end the session there then. And like I said, I will get the link put onto YouTube, and I'll put the link onto the pages as soon as I can.